The diviners, the priest, the wisdom of our brothers and sisters. For those who want to be here and those who are not here, we greet those who are standing, those who are sitting, those who are neither sitting nor standing. We greet those who we see and those we do not see. We take a moment in reflection of the great African spirit to overcome great obstacles, to persevere, to move forward in the midst of a continued struggle.
When the slave trade began, many slaves were taken from the west coast of Africa where the Yoruba tribes lived. When they were brought to the New World, their only identity was the religious practices they previously held. Ife Orisha, Akan, Paolo. The Spanish and French were Catholic and believed in praying to God. But also by praying to different saints for different needs, the slaves were able to associate saints with certain Orishas. By masking the religious practice with Catholic saints, they were able to pray to the Orishas. Saint Barbara is the equivalent of Shango, the patron or god of thunder. Yemoja is associated with Mother Mary. Obatala is associated with Jesus Christ, and all are servants of the Creator, the Almighty. He is Oludumare, Santaria, Shango, Vudun, Candomblé. All of these religions originate from the Yoruba, Akan, and Paolo. The Caribbean was greatly influenced by the traditional religious practices in Cuba, Puerto Rico, Brazil, Haiti, Trinidad and Tobago, and the Dominican Republic. These practices are still continuing today.
I think there is a certain thing as voodoo or black magic or wicked spirits, because the Bible talks about there's evil and vicious and wicked spirit. I don't believe that there's any human being that can operate voodoo on somebody to make them lose their mind or something like that. But I believe there is an evil spirit that people can be turned over, or they turn themselves over to an evil spirit, which the Bible calls a reprobated mind.
The misconceptions that people perceive from the media and lack of knowledge stereotype these practices as black magic, witchcraft, false idol worship, and paganism, mostly because the idea of blood sacrifice and spiritual possession is looked down upon.
You still have films and TV shows and commercials that suggest that voodoo is full of evil, human sacrifice, devil worship. So it's still out there, and a lot of my students will tell me that when they grew up in Miami, for example, and knew that a particular student was Haitian, they would be afraid of that student because the student might put some voodoo on them or something, they thought.
Well, my favorite misconception is that it's devil worship, and I find that particularly ironic because we don't believe in the devil.
These traditional practices involve rituals or ceremonies that included giving an offering to the Orisha. Some offerings would involve animal sacrifice, such as chickens, goats, rams, and lamb. However, candy, rum, gin, and cigars would also be offered to the Orisha. This particular action is what Christians today shy away from.
People look at the kinds of things that we do as being alchemy or manipulating the forces. And my answer to that is that what we do is no different than prayer. Our prayers sometimes are material. When I make an ebo, when I make a dish of food for my shrine, my prayer is physicalized, whereas someone else might just make a prayer and it might just be words. And so I don't really see a difference between my physicalized prayers and their verbal prayers.
But traditionalists believe manifesting a physical offering to the Orisha is more gratifying.
Well, I think in the Old Testament it talks about animal sacrifice, but I believe we're living under grace now. And I believe that while we use animal sacrifices to atone for our sins, we believe as Methodists that Jesus has paid the ultimate sacrifice. So there needs to be no more shedding of blood for the remission of our sins because Jesus paid it all on a hill called Calvary.
I think that at this day and time, animal sacrifice, there's no need to be any other sacrifice in terms of salvation or man being saved, because in the Old Testament there was the sacrificial offering made each year for the people of God to go into the holies of holies and be saved. And they would lift up a animal sacrifice, taking a perfect dove. But after Christ came, he was our perfect sacrifice. So there's now no need for any other sacrifice.
The altars the traditionalists place their offerings on are designed based off the colors, trinkets, and other things that represent the Orisha.
The things that I put down are things that are special to her. So I might prepare a dish that is made with particular foods that she likes or particular vegetables. Sometimes she wants them cooked, sometimes she doesn't. She takes gin.
Theories of how the traditional religious practices vary, from the slave masters beating it out of the slaves to the Christians labeling the practices as ungodlike or black magic.
Because of the Middle Passage, slaves in this country were separated. Families were separated, language and ethnic groups were separated. They could hardly communicate with each other, much less preserve traditions in their own native languages. So they had to create a new rootedness in African traditions that went across ethnic groups and across families.
Black people were somewhat isolated from each other, and they were existing in very small numbers, unlike they were in places like Louisiana or in South Carolina where you have the Gullah Islands, or in the Caribbean where black people were actually oftentimes in the majority. So what you had was almost like a very dilute population. Black people were living kind of far apart, and they were living in small numbers and in close quarters in white families. And so in those contexts, I can imagine that it might be difficult to maintain whole practices.
A lot of the slaves brought the religion with them, disguised as it were, because when they were on the slave boats, they would have a cry, Obatala, Ron Milowo, which is saying, help me, help us. And this is something that they hadn't brought with them.
We were first initially broken away from our families and taken to the Caribbean, and then further taken on, broken away from our families that we have reconstructed in the Caribbean and brought to the Americas.
There was no such thing as Methodist, Baptist, Presbyterian. They came from a tribe of people that believe in a higher power, and that was God himself.